Karly Burch. I am a lecturer in sociology at the University of Auckland. I'll hold it really close. Okay, so I have a lot of ideas to share. I'm going to throw them out there and see how it goes. But I've lived in Japan for almost a decade. I grew up in Hawaii as a settler, so I have my own relationship to the ocean and insights into what happened in the immediate aftermath of the nuclear disaster, how these dominant nuclear standards come in to try to convince people that, nuclear pollution, nuclear waste, it's all safe, don't worry about it, keep eating, keep going on with business as usual. But I really want us to be thinking about when we see a nuclear disaster, when we think about nuclear testing and nuclear detonations, it's really important to put it in the context of nuclear imperialism and nuclear colonialism. So nuclear imperialism is our dominant geopolitical order. It's a power that comes from harnessing the murderous power of uranium. So uranium comes from the land. Like we've already heard, you cannot take nuclear issues away from the land, away from the waters. It's really important. Nuclear imperialism requires nuclear colonialism. It's a key strategy of sustaining nuclear imperialism, and it involves targeting indigenous peoples and their lands and waters to sustain the nuclear production process. And nuclear colonialism, whenever you talk about that, it means you don't believe in this abstract imaginary extraction between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy technologies, because both of those technologies share the same infrastructures. They both require mining, they both require processing, they both require waste. Waste is an important part of all of this. So the waste has to go somewhere. And that's where these dominant standards are really important, because basically there is a scientific consensus that there is no safe dose of ionizing radiation. There is no threshold. You cannot say below this amount it is safe. That is why you hear, no one is saying it's safe. They're saying there will be negligible effects. That is a legal term, and that is because the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA standards, are basically legal threshold standards. So they're saying up to this amount, it's legally allowable to pollute. It's legally allowable to have bodies exposed to a certain amount of ionizing radiation. And so it's really important that when we hear these things and we hear these approvals, we're thinking of them in legal terms, because that's really what this is all about. And so I guess it's really important to be thinking about, a lot of times the New Zealand government, when they're talking about these things, they're talking about this history of nuclear weapons detonations. I don't like to use the word tests, because they weren't tests, they were really detonating weapons. The Cold War was a limited nuclear war, but it was targeted at a lot of indigenous peoples and their lands and waters. And so it's important to think of nuclear colonialism and connect that history of detonating nuclear weapons in Mururoa, in the Marshall Islands, to the dumping of nuclear wastewater into the Pacific, because both of those are textbook examples of nuclear colonialism. So we need to see those trends, we need to see it in this wider context. I study about the standards, so I did write some things out, and I'll be reading it because I had to prepare it, but I want that context to be very clear, and that those connections, we're not reproducing those imaginary separations between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy when we're thinking about these things. Because it often gets framed as, TEPCO is doing this in a planned, controlled, peaceful way. It's different from those nuclear weapons that are, murderous, unsustainable. Nuclear energy is sustainable, weapons are unsustainable. Nuclear energy is peaceful, weapons are murderous. They all depend on the same infrastructures. They all produce nuclear waste. So, as an overview, yesterday, August 24th, 2023, Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, began discharging 1.3 million tons of nuclear wastewater from Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific Ocean. The discharge is planned to take at least 30 years, possibly more. The nuclear wastewater exists because TEPCO has been using the water to cool melted nuclear fuel rods within Fukushima Daiichi's damaged nuclear energy reactors since the onset of the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster of 2011. The water itself is nuclear waste, which means Japan is legally responsible for managing it. Japan first announced its plan to use the Pacific Ocean as its nuclear waste repository back in 2021. To go ahead with the plan, Japan needed to receive approval from the United Nations International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA. The IAEA is an important but extremely compromised organization because it has conflicting responsibilities of both promoting nuclear energy and regulating nuclear technologies. So it's promoting nuclear energy as it's also regulating nuclear energy. There is a long-standing scientific consensus that there is no safe dose of ionizing radiation. That means, as I've already said, there is no safety threshold for exposure to nuclear waste. All exposure to ionizing radiation increases risks of biological harm. However, all nuclear technologies create nuclear waste. So the IAEA standards are based on a threshold limit, but those threshold limits only show the amount of waste that is legal to expose people to, not what is safe. And again, that's why you hear governments saying there will be negligible radiological impacts on people and the environment, because they can't actually say it will be safe according to scientific consensus. The IAEA approved TEPCO's nuclear wastewater plant in July of this year, so just last month. Until that point, TEPCO scientists had been working hard to collect data to show that the company's wastewater plant aligned with the IAEA's legal standards. As was already mentioned, the IAEA's legal standards are extremely narrow in their focus. They only require that scientists ask questions about chemistry and external radiation dose. That doesn't mean a lot if you're talking about internalizing these radionuclides or sending them out into complex ecosystems for decades. At the same time as this was happening, the Pacific Islands Forum gathered a group of independent, globally renowned scientists to review TEPCO's data and provide insights on the possible biological and ecological consequences of the wastewater release. So those scientists were trying to answer questions that were relevant to people in the Pacific. Unfortunately, the data they received from TEPCO could not adequately answer their questions. So the scientists working with the Pacific Islands Forum publicly voiced their scientific concerns about TEPCO's wastewater plan. Unfortunately, the IAEA completely disregarded these concerns when approving the plan. The IAEA also disregarded the concerns of other scientists, including scientists from more than 100 US-based marine laboratories who wrote a really important position paper in December 2022 expressing concerns about the scientific basis of the plan and how policies were not reflective of the most advanced scientific findings. They particularly pointed out how the underlying assumption that dilution is the solution to pollution is extremely outdated, and it completely ignores the reality of biological processes. This is the assumption and logic behind this dumping. So what were some of the main concerns shared by those scientists working with the Pacific Islands Forum? First, they said that TEPCO's data was, quote, incomplete, inadequate, and inconsistent, unquote. Second, they said that the IAEA did not follow its own standards, which would have required TEPCO clearly illustrated that countries beyond Japan received some sort of benefit from the wastewater discharge, and that any benefit they received would outweigh any possible harms. The scientists shared that the fact that there were absolutely no benefits to countries outside of Japan should disqualify the plan under the IAEA's own standards. They allowed Japan to say that this was not an issue, and so they kind of just let it go along. So Japan made the decision to dump, and there were no questions made about the benefits anywhere else. The third point was that, as was already mentioned, TEPCO has many other options for storing its own nuclear waste on land. These scientists even went out of their way to propose a plan which would involve using the wastewater to create concrete that could be used to patch up all of the leaks on site at Fukushima Daiichi and engage in other remedial work that is needed. However, Japan rejected the plan. One of the reasons was because this concrete would be classified as nuclear waste according to Japanese laws. So we can see in this case how the IAEA's legal approval allows Japan to discharge its own responsibilities for managing its nuclear waste on land by using the Pacific Ocean as its own dumping grounds. So we can see that TEPCO's wastewater discharge plan is scientifically questionable. It was also designed to serve the interests of TEPCO and the Japanese nuclear industry at the possible expense of people throughout Japan and the Pacific. But it also raises a number of really important questions about whether more states will start breaking from international norms and begin pursuing this option in the near future. So ocean dumping was the earliest method of nuclear waste disposal, and it largely ended with the implementation of international agreements such as the London Convention, which went into force in 1975, and the Treaty of Rarotonga, which went into force in 1986. And there were other international agreements such as the Convention on the Law of the Sea that set up legal mechanisms to hold states accountable for polluting the high seas. Japan's decision to release its nuclear wastewater into the Pacific Ocean goes against these international norms that we've worked really hard to establish, and it sets a dangerous precedent for what might come. So one way to ensure that ocean dumping of nuclear waste does not become a new normal practice again is for someone to file a case against Japan before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So a lot of people have been talking about this for a while. Back in November 2022, I joined others from the Nuclear Connections Across Oceania conference based at the University of Otago, and we encouraged the New Zealand government to do just that, to take Japan to court. The response we received was that the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade had full confidence in the IAEA. Foreign Minister Nanaya Mahuta reiterated her confidence in the IAEA and its, quote, science-based approach, unquote, after the agency's approval of TEPCO's plan in July 2023. She also shared that, quote, New Zealand continues to stand alongside Pacific partners to ensure their concerns are adequately taken on board, unquote. Unfortunately, the New Zealand government's words are not reflected in their actions. For example, the New Zealand government says it follows a science-based approach to TEPCO's wastewater release, but completely disregarded serious concerns raised by prominent international scientists, including the globally renowned scientists working with the Pacific Islands Forum, which are New Zealand's partners in the Pacific. The New Zealand government also said that they stand alongside their Pacific partners, but in reality, they constantly moved ahead in voicing their public support for the IAEA and constantly framing the concerns of people in the Pacific as somehow being non-evidence-based or unscientific. And there were some government documents released that really clearly showed this, even though, you know, in the public media, it's the way that they say, you know, science-based approach, concerns in the Pacific, concerns in the Pacific. It really makes it out to be a really strange hierarchy of knowledge there. And this has been the case even when Pacific peoples have many legitimate concerns that are beyond the scope of the IAEA's extremely narrow standards, and when scientists working with the Pacific Islands Forum were raising many valid scientific concerns about TEPCO's plans. So the science was under debate and still nothing was heard. It's time for the New Zealand government to be honest and follow their own directives. If they do follow a science-based approach, they need to publicly consider and address the concerns raised by scientists regarding the nuclear wastewater release and the relevance of the IAEA's extremely narrow and outdated standards. They should also stay true to their commitments to standing alongside their Pacific partners. This means following the lead of the Pacific Islands Forum and seriously engaging with all of their concerns, including the concerns raised by the scientists working with them. And going back to the beginning about nuclear colonialism, it's really important that the New Zealand government acknowledges that TEPCO's plan is a continuation of nuclear colonialism in the Pacific. And so it's really problematic to continue with this nuclear-free stance and then stand beside Japan as it is promoting nuclear colonialism in the Pacific. New Zealand has to think about what it's doing and make sure that its words are aligning with its actual actions. Thanks so much.